Well, good evening and welcome to another edition of Bible Topics. It's very good to have you join us this evening, and we have a special guest for the first time here on Bible Topics, Andy Lee of Evangelical Alliance. Andy, great to have you join us this evening.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a privilege. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be here, and really how you came to be involved in Evangelical Alliance.
Yeah, sure. So I am a second-generation immigrant and I'd say first-generation Christian. My parents immigrated to the UK in the early 80s, but it was my sister who first started going to church, and then soon after our whole family followed. And so I became a Christian in my late teenage years after attending a summer youth conference. And then there was, at that time, my dad had bought this newspaper like on a Sunday, like a tabloid, and he brought it home, and it came with this book. He was not interested in the book, he was more interested in the sports. So he just kind of knocked on my door and threw the book on my bed. I picked it up, and it was this book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers. And at that time, that really ignited my passion for personal growth and self-development. It was the kind of stuff that I was thinking, they don't teach this type of thing in school. And that was around the time I came to faith as well. So then I just had this, like, coming to faith was this missing piece of the puzzle for me, where books about personal growth and self-development were a lot of focus on you have the resources within you. It's all about that chanting in the mirror and saying, I'm enough, I can do this, you have all the answers. But really, when you understand whose you are, and when you understand you have a creator and you're this creation, that just fills it in. No, we have this relationship with this God who created us, and so there's a definite purpose, and He is the ultimate source for everything. So all of that to say, then I've worked in corporate for 20 years, kind of molding my faith and deepening my understanding. Because of my passion then for like personal potential, I set up a coaching practice a few years ago, kind of doing one-to-one coaching, and then that pivoted into business coaching, which then pivoted into consulting for businesses to help them lay a foundation for healthy and sustainable growth. And then I felt God nudged me into working for the Evangelical Alliance. And so I've been in that role since January 23.
Tell us a little bit about EA and what you do there.
Yeah, so Evangelical Alliance, membership alliance, and they basically represent the voice of the nations or its members, so either members who are churches or individual members, basically working with government on a lot of those hot topics in like the cultural landscape. So it's basically representing our faith on a kind of a national scale, to kind of really make a difference, to make sure that, hey, as a nation, as a country, that God still has influence in the corridors of power. For me, I work in what's called the public leadership arm of the EA, and the vision for that is basically to transform the cultural landscape by raising up the next generation of emerging Christian professionals in the marketplace.
Fantastic. And that is what we're going to be discussing this evening here on Bible Topics, public leadership. Now, there's a quote from your bio on the EA website, Andy. It says that you have a passion for seeing emerging leaders grow into their God-given assignment for the sake of the kingdom across the world. What does this growing process entail and look like for you?
Yeah, well, so I didn't give it that much thought when I wrote the bio, but since I knew this question was coming, I thought, I'd better break this down. Yeah. So I think there were three parts to it. There's the emerging leader part, there's the growing into part, and then there's the God-given assignment part. So the emerging leader part, the simplest and clearest definition of leadership that I've come across, and you might have come across this yourself, is John Maxwell's definition, where leadership is influence. 3 simple words. 7, if you add in the 4 words after it, nothing more, nothing less. And so I found that the kind of first shift for people is to shift their paradigm from asking the question of, am I a leader, to how can I be a more effective leader. So we just don't focus so much on asking if you are, because if you have an opportunity to influence anybody, you are.
Right.
So move more into like how you lead.
So leadership is relevant then for everyone.
For everyone. Like unless you have been called to kind of live in a cave in isolation for your whole life, then maybe not so much. But otherwise, you are, whether you're an introvert, extrovert, outspoken or not, you know, even your very presence walking into a room and you say nothing for that whole duration of the meeting or the room, you have influence. Your presence is felt. So it's understanding and owning that, you know, and that's so that when we are confident and we claim that responsibility, and then it's an exciting exploration of, well, how does God want to use me? Like, use my influence. So that's one. Then there's the growing into, and that's just the journey of realizing our potential. I don't think we can ever fulfill our potential here on earth, but that doesn't mean that we ever stop. Like, it's God delights in when we grow and when we discover more of who He made us to be. Kind of like when you see your child take their first steps, say their first words, you know, or someone you mentor reach or achieve at their first milestone. You take delight in that process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And then the third thing is the God-given assignment. And so I'll read from Jeremiah here. Jeremiah 1:4-5 says, "The word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." So this verse emphasizes the fact that Jeremiah was especially selected by God to spread his word, bring truth and light to the people everywhere, just as we were also created for a special purpose. So understanding that, hey, all of your strengths and weaknesses, or your personality, your likes and dislikes, all of that, that's what makes you unique. And therefore also you have a unique assignment that's kind of aligned with that.
Now, is this in sync with Evangelical Alliance's own definition of public leadership? How does it see public leadership, and what are its primary endeavors in sort of instilling that growth within individuals?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned before, like, the vision is to transform the cultural landscape of the nations, right? Like, it's let me find actually and I'll read from this because it's taken from the website, right? So it's a quote from the Evangelical Alliance. The strapline is "Together making Jesus known." It's an active evangelical faith in politics, education, evangelism, church planting, the arts, and every other aspect of nature, which is making a profound difference throughout communities for the sake of the gospel. It's speaking up on behalf of those who are maligned and marginalized. It's affirming freedoms. It's proclaiming the good news of Jesus in words and action. And so that, the Evangelical Alliance, within EA then, we believe it's essential to have culture shaping Christians in every aspect of society. You know, because imagine that you have prominent Christian leaders in areas of the arts or in politics or in business or in engineering that are in high profile and influential positions. You know, they get to affect the kingdom. They get to extend and expand the kingdom of God right in the workplace.
That's fantastic. Now, in Exodus 18:21, Moses is counseled to select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And really, this is a call to select leaders, to select outstanding leaders of good character and evident integrity. At the same time, we of course have the reality that Scripture interprets Scripture and it balances it out. We see that there are some individuals in Scripture who, where they begin, it doesn't really come across as they have evident leadership at all, or like they're in a prime position. And this is what I really want to put before our viewers, because some of you guys are probably thinking, well, what does this program have to do with me? And you've already heard what Andy has said regarding leadership as influence, and even if you walk into a room and you sit down and you're not saying anything, there's still influence that you have just by being present. Hopefully that's set with you. But I want to reiterate that just because you may not feel you're in a place of leadership or valued as a leader does not mean that you don't have influence. If you consider someone like Joseph, of course, in his family, he had enough influence to be hated by his brothers, and that where did that lead him? He exercised his giftings, and he ends up as a slave in Egypt. Not only as a slave in Egypt, but as if things couldn't get any worse, he's falsely accused of violating his master's wife. His integrity and good character is completely smeared with these false allegations. He's thrown into a prison cell where he has these dodgy characters who've attempted assassination of the Pharaoh. It gets even worse, because after one of these guys is released on communicating, after Joseph has communicated the meaning of their dreams, he forgets completely about Joseph and what has happened. So he's just rotting. He's not elected to be in a cave, isolated. He's rotting in this prison cell. And what's clear is that God, even in that prison cell, he uses him to be an influence in the lives of his co-prisoners. And God, in using that, ultimately works out a future release for Joseph, where he, just completely against all odds, rises to a position using the influence he has, where he is, using the giftings God has given for his glory, rises to the place where he's second in command to Pharaoh.
Yeah. It's an amazing story. And I love that you bring that up, actually. So if you think about when Joseph was in prison, he had no official position of authority or leadership,
right,
but he was exercising leadership throughout that whole time. So I just want to make a distinction that, hey, it's not, you don't necessarily have to prep to be in an official leadership position to be leading other people, right? You just have to, this idea of leading, you're leading the people around you, everybody you interact with, leading yourself, allowing yourself to be led by God. And so it's that faithfulness during his time in prison, regardless of the circumstances, he was just being faithful, that ultimately turned everything around for him.
What I find incredibly important to recognize in that story and in so many other stories in the scriptures is when you've highlighted that one word, faithfulness. Faithfulness always leads to fruitfulness, always. But so often I find that there are individuals, and this is a challenge to would-be young leaders in prime positions of leadership, where I'm thinking like directorship, CEO type stuff, that sort of stereotypical definition of leader that's there. So many are trying to have that before being faithful. They're trying to see the fruit of recognized leadership before they've actually shown themselves faithful even in the small things. And just a word of challenge, until you are faithful in the small things, until you are faithful in the small roles, you'll never be deemed worthy of those greater roles of influence and those bigger spheres of activity. Joseph was there faithful in prison. He didn't give up. He didn't stop being faithful, and so his life bore fruit. And I believe it's the same with all of us. You can consider even another story of like Joshua who succeeded Moses, and he led the Israelites into the promised land. Military campaigns, all of that. Well, Joshua didn't start as a leader in the world's view often of leadership. Joshua started alongside Caleb, going against the grain, going against and speaking against the influence of 10 other spies who he alongside Caleb had entered the promised land with, who came back with a negative report. There were 12 who went into the promised land. 10 came out saying, yeah, great place, but impossible to take. And there was, Andy, so much hand wringing and just like, well, we're not really sure, this is what's going to happen. We'd be better back in slavery. We'd be better back in Egypt. Why did you bring us out of that? We at least had leeks and onions. I've never heard of people wanting to eat leeks and onions just like that, but apparently it was the delicacy. And then you see Joshua and Caleb, what could they do? What did they do? They could have been silent. They could have caved to pressure and said, well, it's majority, so we must be missing something. No, they were willing to be considered foolish and ignorant and probably rash and stupid and crazy even. They were willing to stand up and speak out and say, no, God will give us this land. They didn't demean the other 10 to do that. They simply exhibited trust in God.
Yeah.
And that paved the way for that fruit wherein Joshua and Caleb would eventually see the people into the promised land.
Yeah, 100%. So let me backtrack a little bit to something you said before, and I love that about faithfulness leads to fruitfulness. And yet, so only until we are faithful with the small things, small responsibilities, do we then have more opportunities for the big things, right? And yet, in reality, we see a lot of leaders rise up into big positions of influence, and maybe they haven't really stewarded that position very well.
Right.
Right. So it's like, and I think that's that kind of tension where, hey, God has given us this. He allows, He permisses. How do we steward those kind of choices and decisions? And so that's how you end up with like leaders who rise up and they're fallen because they've taken their eye off glorifying God, but really it's like a personal gain, like they're motivated by personal agendas. We've seen even in Christian circles a lot of recent scandals. Some of these have been fairly high profile in the press. Where is it that we often see leadership fail? You've touched on one element there. Is that the only element? Is that the main element? And really, why does it occur? What can we do to prevent that in the future? Yeah, well, that's a big question. So love to hear your view on this as well. Like, I haven't done a kind of deep dive investigation into the scandals, but we see it on the news, right? It's quite big when these things happen. And the one word that kind of comes to my mind when I see, oh, there's another one, is accountability or lack of it. A British historian, Lord Acton, famously said, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think this reflects a general observation about the potential dangers of unchecked power and the misuse of power. Now, I guess the question is, how is the responsibility shared amongst those that were involved in these kind of horrible things happening when leaders kind of fall from grace? And I think there are like 3 possibilities here. I think number 1, they knew what was going on, but they didn't see anything wrong about it. And that's a reflection of a lack of spiritual maturity and spiritual revelation, like whereas the conviction and recognizing red flag. I think they knew what was going on and knew it was wrong, but didn't speak up. And I think that speaks to poor structures in place for transparent, open, honest communication, feedback, that type of thing that lends itself to good accountability. Or third, they didn't know what was going on, which means there was 0 accountability structure in place. I mean, those are the 3 I came up with. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think accountability is very much at the core of it. I want to read a letter, actually. A letter that this was written to me on the occasion of my 13th birthday, quite some years ago now, by my father. And I'll read just part of it. but he touches on a few things that I believe are at the root of a lot of the problems we're seeing. And I regularly read this and review it myself to make sure that I'm setting this example for my own family. Happy birthday. I'm grateful to my Father in heaven for the privilege of being your father on earth. I don't use the word privilege lightly. That's exactly what being your father has been, a privilege. You are a truly remarkable boy. Hence, I sense the need to write to you about something that has been troubling me. Very few remarkable boys ever become remarkable men. The pages of history are littered with the sad tales of those who possessed great promise at an early age, only to squander it in the end. It is a sobering reality. Why do you suppose this happens? Do you think it can be avoided? If so, what steps should one such as yourself take in order to escape the tragedy of becoming a castaway? Of course, such matters rest ultimately in the sovereignty of God. However, you must never let God's sovereignty be used as an excuse for failing to exercise your responsibility. I would suggest the following two things. You must be prayerful. You must pray not only at the table with me, not only at the bedside with your mother, not only in the church services with your fellow believers. You must spend time alone with God, speaking to Him and listening for Him to speak to you. Prayerlessness is a sin and leads to other sins. However, prayerlessness is not so much a root sin as it is a fruit sin. This means that prayerlessness typically comes as a result of some other sin. In most cases, the culprit is self-reliance, that stubborn confidence in the flesh. Though self-reliance plagues us all, it is an even more formidable foe for those with unusual gifts. Regan, be on guard. Do not place confidence in the flesh. Be prayerful. Next, you must not be prideful. What do you have that you have not received? If you received it, why do you boast as though you received it not? These words, originally penned by Paul to the Corinthians, have an equal claim on your life to the claim they held on the first recipients. You must not be prideful. You are not better than anyone. Anything you are, anything you have, anything you can do is by the grace of God. Forget this for one moment, and you are doomed to the fate of being a formerly remarkable person. And he goes on a little bit. And
wow.
That
was from your father?
Yeah.
Wise man.
And honestly, I've seen how where both of those elements set in, and in dealing with people on a regular basis, the two do walk hand in hand. And recent scandals that have been well publicized, recent stories, blogs about those from individuals who did remain silent in some cases for one reason or another, rightly or wrongly for many years. You can stand out and see, okay, at the root of it all, there is that sin that is pride. And that often leads to this sense of self-reliance that leads us away from prayer.
Yeah. No, you're so good, Regan, so good, and I agree. So I've got like 3 criteria, and again, would love to kind of get your input. They're not the top 3, they're not like only 3, but in order to kind of have a meaningful public leadership, right? And the first is to be servant-hearted, and in Matthew 20:26-28 it says, "Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so I know that in theory, I think a lot of Christians would understand this concept of servant leadership. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. We kind of know this in theory, servant leadership. And Jesus modeled it like perfectly for us. Where do we still trip up? But we know it. Where do you think we still trip up with that?
With servant leadership itself. I think there is a sense in which we see some tasks as beneath. I think that's often what happens. I remember being at a training program some years ago, And on the first day of that training program, this was a leaders training program particularly for would-be pastors and teachers. Everyone there had that aspiration that the scriptures speak of to eldership, the office of an elder. The one who desires that aspires to be an elder, desires a noble thing, is what the scripture says. On the very first day of that training, we were sort of lined up, and each of us was given a particular cleaning role for this building. Toilets, mirrors in the toilets, floors, walls, baseboards. We were all given a role, and we were told this was going to be the first session of the program. And there was a man who refused. He said, I came, for pastor's training. I didn't come to clean toilets. And, God's calling me to be a pastor, not a toilet cleaner, basically. Well, probably about a quarter, maybe half of the guys in that training program, half of us would go on to be pastors. The others, including that individual who dropped out very, very soon, would go their own way and do their own thing and not develop into that calling that they once professed to have had. And I think there's something there. I think when we view certain tasks as beneath us, whether that's it's not just for pastors, of course, this is for leaders in general. If you are not willing to do things that are outside of your zone or outside of your job description, you're not really going to get anywhere. Example, I was last year was on holiday with family, and I was having early morning coffee, and the little cafe in the hotel overlooked the swimming pool. And I saw the manager of the hotel, who, he had plenty of staff. It wasn't his job, it wasn't his responsibility. Going around, making checks at the pool, testing everything. He picked up a broom, started sweeping, making sure everything was neat and tidy. He was the boss of everything. Right? He was the one everyone else was going to, but he was setting the standard. He was doing the janitor's job to make it easier for the janitor and to free them up for other things as well. And I looked and I thought, that's a good manager. That's a good leader, because he is not viewing that as beneath him. He's not cracking the whip saying, you guys do that, or why aren't you doing it? He's taking initiative.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. And that exercise you mentioned, I'm going to steal that. If I ever have an opportunity to do that, I'm going to do that. Well, it's a great filter.
Public leadership, yeah. Evangelical Alliance public leadership program. Session 1.
Going to clean the toilets.
Yeah.
Going to wash the kitchen tops. Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's the leaders just understanding that leading doesn't set you necessarily, it doesn't set you apart from the followers. You're still amongst them. They need to be able to relate to you. You have to be able to show that you're walking with them, and you're not setting yourself on this pedestal and distancing yourself away and just giving instructions that you wouldn't follow yourself. I think it's that. And you touched on that, and I think there's humility, which is closely related. Right? In Philippians 2:3-4, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. And I think that because of the scandals and whatnot and abuse of power, you see a lack of humility, and you touched on that, like the pride, the personal agenda, the kind of blinkers that you have on when suddenly you're when you have a platform to lead from. But I think a good behavior, and these are very simple things that I use, I'm conscious of, and if people ask me, I'll tell them. Actually, as a leader, a way to keep yourself in that humble state is to be curious, to learn from the people that you're leading, and to ask very simple questions, but actually they can be quite vulnerable. A question such as, how can I be of better service to you?
Absolutely.
Right. And another one could be, what do you notice about my leadership that you think I don't notice about myself? And you think they're just so simple, but it's not. You can, a bit like asking people to clean the toilets, or when you ask people to ask these questions, like, oh no, right? There's something there, and that it exposes something that needs to be resolved in their heart.
I remember there was a church where they had accumulated a lot of clutter. It was not in a good state, and things were falling apart in more ways than one. And oftentimes our physical environment is a reflection of our spiritual well-being. And in this particular occasion, it was very much so. The church was in a dire state and was even at one point considering closing its doors. And it was pointed out, and there were some discussions, and it was mentioned that this place needs a skip. We need a skip, and we need to chuck everything into it. For American viewers, a skip is what we call a dumpster or something like that. We need a massive clear out. And the guy responded, and he wasn't being sarcastic. He said, "I'm a pastor. I don't do that sort of thing. I don't do skips." And you think, okay, there's a lot of rubbish that we need to clear out in our lives, physically, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. If we're not willing to do that, things will continue to rot. Things will continue to go in a very, very bad direction. The humility which you speak of, I believe it entails a genuine inquisitiveness and a genuine interest in the lives of the people that we're serving. Far too often, I think people are trying to serve their imaginary audience, people that are not around them, than the people who are right in front of them. Yeah. And so what happens, they lose the people who are right in front of them. They have no influence in the lives of the actual people they can influence.
Yeah.
They're trying to serve this particular contingency. And he's speaking pastorally. I believe it's why so many churches are actually declining, why so many churches are failing to grow, because they are trying to reach Christians, and we are in a post-Christian environment. We need to be trying to reach the lost and make disciples, but no, we're still trying to reach people with very churchy language. We're still trying to reach people, lost individuals, as if they're going to be interested by a service or a talk or something. And sometimes, yes, there are certain events, certain talks that we can invite, and we should. I'm not saying that's not what God uses, because He does use that, but we need to go beyond that. We need to do more in that regard. A verse, though, which stands out from the Proverbs. Proverbs is filled with wisdom, and we can think of how these writings were written essentially to the children of kings. And Solomon, likely being the author of most of the Proverbs, probably writing these words for his own son to some degree, who then went on to break up the whole kingdom and not act wisely. But there were also words for Solomon. And Proverbs 29:2 says, "When the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan." We're in such a dissatisfied society. I see it in every sector. And it's not just that overt wickedness where there's extreme perversion and immorality. So often it's much more subtle than that. It's the pride that drives people into a place of emotional and mental destruction. It's the belittling, higher, holier than thou attitude, which can be equally detrimental. And it sees this real sense of grief across every area of our world.
Yeah, no, it's so true. That's profound. I love. That's a great verse. That's a great verse.
Proverbs 29:2.
Yeah.
There's a question. Another question I want to ask you here. What are your top 5 key issues or values that you consider important for public leaders to uphold? We've touched on some of these, but if you could boil it down briefly for our viewers, and I want you guys to take some notes here, okay? Take some notes, get your pen and paper out, write down these 5 values to look for and try to uphold.
Again, these aren't necessarily top 5, are not an exhaustive list here, so I'll just say them. I think what you do is more important than what you say, but make sure that what you say aligns with what you do. That's integrity. Second, how you do something is as important as the end result. And I think that's so key. I think we talked about before how God delights in the progress, in us discovering our potential, discovering the next kind of level of faithfulness, the next level of understanding of our purpose and our role in His kingdom. Just as the same way that we delight in seeing our children grow up and learn new things and experience. We have to remember that process, like it's character forming, it molds us, it shapes us. That in some cases can be more important than the end result. And that is what we can control. Right? Using like kind of corporate speak, we kind of call these things lead indicators. A lot of times we can report on lag indicators, like let's say church attendance was this, or offering was this amount, or etc. baptisms, but they're lag indicators. By the time you know those numbers, it's kind of telling you like what like you can't change that. But lead indicators are the things that you do on a daily basis. It's the process, it's the steps, it's the way that you behave and act and serve like daily, weekly. So that love people, that's being relational. I think one of the challenges in public leadership, and this is where the public leader program really helps support, is that Christians are generally the minority in those environments. I mean, there are challenges that both Christians in working in ministry and outside of ministry face, but one of the distinct differences is that in the secular world, you're a minority. You could be the only Christian that your colleagues know of, that you work alongside. So you have this almost extra weight of representing the voice of the faith. How do you navigate that? How do you have those conversations in a loving way? And you know, so that's loving the people, but also finding a way to dialogue about some of those values that don't align with your own. Another one, and I love this one, it's cultivating and sharing your gifts and your talents. Basically, blessed to be a blessing. Blessings are not given solely for the benefit of the person being blessed, the person who receives them. That means so material things, let's say food and clothes and your shelter, your house, like share those. But also, what are the things that you are good at? What are your skills? What are those things you're really interested in that you have this kind of weird, like, over passion about that other people don't, that makes you stand out? Share them. They're meant to be a blessing. God wants you to bless other people with it. And the last thing I have here is that be ready and willing to give an account for your actions and decisions. And that's about being transparent and about being open to be held accountable. 1 Peter 3:15 says, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect.
Absolutely. You've mentioned again and again humility, you've mentioned servant leadership, you've mentioned even there in that verse, do this with gentleness and respect. Matthew 20:25-28, Jesus says to his disciples, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. And it seems very clear that this is, it's like an oppressive leadership, an oppressive rulership. They're lording it over. We know what that's like. We know how that feels and whatever. Not so with you. Instead, Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So service is at the key, is the core of it. Leadership is not over. Leadership, in some ways, is under. Leadership is not putting down things on the people. Leadership is holding up the people.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we so often get it wrong. I think that's why we have, at times in corporate organizations, charitable organizations alike, such high turnover, where the view of leadership, and it may be a successful company, a successful charitable endeavor, but the turnover is often there because the leadership is down, and it's kind of more, it's giving orders to and directing down rather than holding up.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And I think in line with that, there are leaders who don't set out to intentionally lead badly.
Right.
And they could actually be very aware of the type of leadership that you just described. What can happen, though, is that they feel a sense of pressure in their own leadership that they have to know the answers because they're leading. And so they carry this weight of, well, there are people following me, and let's say, for example, vision casting, right? You know, without vision, people perish. So then there's this weight of, well, I have to make sure that I can give people answers to questions, and et cetera, et cetera. And so you kind of fall into this trap of then, if you're not hearing from God and there isn't any clarity, you're forcing it, you're forcing the issue. And actually, there's this humility in just being able to say, I don't know. And that can be tough. It's similar to when leaders are strong enough in their identity to admit mistakes and to apologize for them. It's that kind of personality trait. I think it's subtle, and it doesn't necessarily mean a leader is, you know, like malicious or deliberately rebelling, but they've just, this pressure has come on them, and they don't realize actually they're now taking more control of their own leadership, using their own intelligence versus like having a channel to God and listening to the Holy Spirit.
I think a lot of times people will go into a role of more public leadership wherein they are recognized by others as a leader. It goes beyond that foundational level of leadership that we've also touched on. And they have the mindset of, well, I need to make my mark. I need to leave my mark.
Yeah.
But, you know, leaving a mark isn't always a good thing. Like, I need to make my mark, you know, just beating people down. That's not what you want.
Right.
But a lot of the time, I think that happens because of two areas. I think, first of all, there's personal insecurity, which is always rooted in pride. Okay, personal insecurity, it can accompany like imposter syndrome and stuff. That can be the more polite, you know, we feel. And so there's personal insecurity. You might not feel fully stable in that role, or you might not feel fully respected in that role, or maybe you do know that you're not really equipped for that role. In which case, that might be so. You can acknowledge that, and you can go before the throne of God's grace and plead for His supernatural power and help, and like Solomon, pray for wisdom. And God gives to any who asks Him in faith with no doubting. So you can do that, and I would encourage you to do that. That's always a good exercise for any of us. But then, in addition to personal insecurity, there's very often professional jealousy. And so you see maybe another organization or another grouping, and you see someone who you know they do something better. And maybe they're in your own organization, and you know that that person is leaving a better mark, and you somehow can't figure it out. You somehow, you want a little bit of that, but what you do then is you might even make that individual your target.
Yeah.
And you might try to undercut or demean or in some way discredit that individual. We see this in the scriptures as well, this sort of attitude and sort of action. The individuals who were jealous over Daniel and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and they deliberately sought to undermine them in various ways and target them. It doesn't stop. Daniel, very much like Joseph, rises essentially to be second in command of the whole of the Persian Empire by being faithful and not letting it get to him, keeping his head down and pressing on. Now, you and Evangelical Alliance, you have this wonderful initiative. It's a public leadership program. Tell us a little bit about that and why it's important. And tell us what makes this program different from other leadership programs.
Yeah, sure. So most Christian professionals, I'd say, and that's anecdotal, find it challenging to maximize their kingdom influence in the workplace, and for some of the reasons that we've discussed before. So the Evangelical Alliance have developed a program that helps believers confidently step into the leadership assignment that God's given them, because we believe that every follower of Jesus has the potential to change the world, like literally. There are many challenges that Christian professionals face in the marketplace, but we could sum that up into 3 areas. First one, ethical dilemmas, like balancing your personal convictions with your professional responsibilities. Second, the cultural pressures to navigating a secular culture that might clash with Christian values. Right? So there's a lot of hot current topics right now. Sexuality, gender, just to name kind of 2 examples. How do we navigate those when even company policies are being updated that might slightly shift the way certain things work? Simple things like pronouns in email signatures or lanyards that represent a particular group, right? What's the answer? How do you navigate things like that? How do you not lean away and then just have no influence? How do you have influence leaning in, but do it in a way that builds bridges rather than destroys them, right? And third, marginalization. So maybe facing discrimination or opposition because of your faith. Maybe there's apprehension to speak up because if you did and people knew what you really thought and knew your underlying beliefs, you're kind of casted out. You're not cool anymore. You don't get invited to things, or maybe it even harms your career progression. So those they're very real and relevant issues that are happening right now currently. So our program doesn't, be clear, does not hand you these answers to these questions on a plate. I wish it did. That'd be amazing. But it provides that space for us to navigate and explore those issues. And it's done so in a way that's individual and tailored as well, because everybody's situation is different. Where they work, the position they work in, how long they've been in their career so far, all of those things. So the program is this 10-month-long discipleship journey where they really get to understand the cultural landscape and how to see, not just be aware of the challenges, but actually see the opportunity in them. Right? So you can actually be proactively and excited for these things rather than, oh no, I wish they don't bring that up. Right? So you have the confidence to know how to handle yourself in those situations. Another one would be, say, competence. So really understanding your unique assignment. There's a general assignment for everyone, and that's going to fulfill the Great Commission. But in terms of your unique traits, the way that God's made you specifically, how does God want to use you? How can you succeed in that assignment? And then there's community. Community isn't a topic that's taught over the course of the program. It's actually kind of baked into the program, because what I've found when I've asked for feedback from past graduates of the program, one of the things that really stuck out for them was the relationships that they built along the way. So you're coming alongside people who might not necessarily be working in the same sector as you, but they share similar challenges. They also share that similar passion to want to see Jesus, like bring Jesus more into the workplace, you know, and be that shining light. On the other side, the guest speakers that we have, and roughly for each program, we probably have like 20 guest speakers coming in, and they're all kind of successful in their own sphere, and we bring them in from different sectors. So it could be the political world, medical field, engineering, business, the arts, entrepreneurship. And they share their wisdom and they share their experience. And what's really great about that is that a lot of these people, if not all of them, are open to continuing that relationship post the program. So these are people that you would never have met elsewhere. And the other thing that's really great about these guest speakers coming in is that they answer questions that the participants of the program didn't even know to ask. Is like, because you're at a certain stage, you haven't experienced a lot of those pitfalls and learned those lessons yet. And so participants like frequently come away thinking, that was great, I didn't even know to think of that as an issue. Yeah. But now I know that that thing exists, and I also kind of know how to handle it. So yeah, it's a fantastic program.
Wonderful. As we begin to enter the last 5 minutes of this program, I want to actually introduce you to this helpful video which outlines the important Evangelical Alliance Public Leaders Program. You can sign up for it yourself.
The Evangelical Alliance has a 30-year vision to bring long-term cultural transformation to the UK by investing in leaders in every walk of life. By joining the 10-month Public Leader Programme, you can become part of that vision. If you're a Christian in any public-facing or leadership role in any part of the UK, this programme will equip you to lead well now and in the years to come. Whatever your cultural or professional context, you can have a lasting influence for kingdom change, bringing the presence of Jesus wherever he has placed you. Over the course of 3 weekend retreats, you'll experience biblical reflection, expert teaching from a wide range of leadership sectors, time with senior public leaders, visits to cultural institutions, mentoring with an experienced leader, and prayer for your sphere of influence.
I would recommend the Public Leadership Programme because it just gives you an opportunity to meet with so many other people who are at the beginning or just kind of near the start of their career, to not just look at how you can be a good leader, but also be a leader that is for God and that you can serve him in your different places.
Not only that, but by joining the programme, you become part of the growing public leader community across the UK. This is a vital expression of our work to realise our 30-year vision of transformation. If you ever feel isolated in your leadership, if you're ever concerned that you're the only one, if you ever wonder where and how you'll be leading in 10 years' time, become part of this programme and join the wider public leader community. To find out more, go to eauk.org/publicleadership.
So please look up that program. How can viewers find out more and sign up?
There's a website link, so you could Google, I think, the Evangelical Alliance Public Leadership, and there should be a section on the website with more information and even details of how to apply.
Wonderful. So please check that out, guys. Final question, how can Christ followers most effectively speak truth to power where public leadership goes wrong? And how can we be better leaders in the realms of responsibility God has given us?
Okay. 3 things, I think. Make sure of your motives. Make sure you're not fueled by a personal agenda, but by a desire for justice and righteousness. So Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people. Second, know your topic. There's this quote I saw on the outside of a Bible college that said, to communicate simply, you must understand profoundly. And I love that. So have a well-rounded view of the issues at hand so you can talk with an informed voice. Engage with humility, recognizing that we're all sinners saved by grace, Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Be brave. One of the phrases that we repeatedly say within the Evangelical Alliance office is we be brave, but we be kind. Mm-hmm. Be brave, stand up for those convictions, for those values, but be kind as well. You know, engage with humility, engage with love. Don't burn those relational bridges. I can't remember if that's 3, but I do have one more, and that's seeking common ground. Meet people where they are to build those bridges of connection. 1 Corinthians 9:22, Paul says, to the weak I become weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some.
Thank you so much, Andy, for joining us for this edition of Bible Topics. And thank you, viewers, as well, for tuning in. And I do pray that you've benefited from this. Wherever you are, whatever you do, you have a place of influence. And so you are in a place of leadership. Strive to honor the Lord in that and with that. It's been a privilege to have you join us. I pray that you'll take these things before God in prayer. And Andy, thanks once more. Viewers, hopefully next week I'll see you again for another episode of Bible Topics.